They don't make things like they used to. That's a cliché, sure, but back in the 50s and 60s, it was the absolute truth. If you lived in Detroit, Pittsburgh, or Cleveland, you didn't need a fancy degree to live like a king. You just needed a pair of work boots and a sense of responsibility. I remember my father coming home from the Ford plant. He smelled like oil and cold air, but he walked with his head high. Why? Because that factory job was a ticket to the middle class. Back then, a guy working the line could buy a house for $15,000, keep a station wagon in the driveway, and still have enough left over for a family vacation to Florida every single summer. The money was real. It wasn't numbers on a screen. It was a thick envelope of cash or a company check that the local grocer would cash for you without a second thought. If you were willing to pull a double shift or work through the weekend, you were rolling in it. We saw guys in their 20s buying boats and lakeside cabins just by putting in the hours at the mill. It was the era of the blue-collar aristocracy. We didn't worry about outsourcing or automation. We were the world's workshop. Every time a car rolled off that line with a Made in USA stamp, it wasn't just a vehicle, it was a piece of our collective wealth. The overtime pay was the secret sauce. You'd volunteer for the holiday shifts, and suddenly you had enough to buy your wife that mink coat she'd been eyeing at the department store. It was hard work, no doubt. Your back would ache and your ears would ring from the machinery, but at the end of the week, when you opened that paycheck, you felt like the master of the universe. America was building itself, and we were the ones getting paid to do it. Before the internet changed everything, if you wanted to make a fortune, you didn't wait for the customers to come to you. You went to them. You've probably heard stories about the Fuller Brush Man or the Electrolux vacuum salesman. Let me tell you, those guys were making more money than some doctors. Selling door to door was the ultimate American hustle. It was pure psychology. You'd knock on a door in a quiet suburb, put on your best smile, and offer a free demonstration. If you were good, I mean really good, you'd walk out of that house 20 minutes later with a signed contract and a fat commission. I knew a guy, Mr. Henderson, who sold encyclopedias. He'd tell parents that without these books, their children would never get into college. He played on their dreams, and it worked. He drove a Cadillac Fleetwood and wore gold rings on 3 fingers. He didn't have a boss, he just had a territory and a pitch. The beauty of it was the uncapped potential. In a factory, you had a ceiling. In sales, the sky was the limit. You could start with nothing but a suitcase and a bus ticket, and within 5 years, you're living in a mansion on the hill. It taught you how to read people, how to handle no, and how to turn a maybe into a yes. It was the era of the gift of gab. Every porch was a new opportunity, and every doorbell was a potential gold mine. People trusted a man in a suit back then. A handshake meant something. It was a different world, where your income was exactly as big as your ambition. If you really wanted to strike it rich, and I mean private jet rich, you headed south. Texas, Oklahoma, Alaska. The oil boom was like the Wild West all over again, but with better machinery. In the 70s, when the oil prices spiked, those fields became the center of the world. I remember the stories of wildcatters. These were men who would sink every penny they had into a hole in the ground, praying for a gusher. And when they hit, it was like the earth was spitting out pure money. But it wasn't just the owners. Even the roughnecks, the guys doing the heavy lifting on the rigs, were making insane money. You'd work 2 weeks straight, 12 hours a day, in the mud and the heat, but then you'd get 2 weeks off and a paycheck that would make a lawyer weep. These guys would fly into town with pockets full of cash, buy a brand new truck with a stack of $100 bills, and spend the rest at the local steakhouse. It was a dangerous, high-stakes game. You could lose a finger or a limb in a heartbeat, but the lure of that black gold was too strong. It was a time of excess. I heard of oil men who would buy a new car every time their old one got a flat tire. It sounds crazy now, but when the wells are pumping thousands of barrels a day, money loses its meaning. It becomes just a way to keep score. It was a rough, tough, and wealthy way of life that defined a whole generation of American dreamers.
If you want to know how the American landscape truly changed, you have to look at the dirt. After the war, and well into the 70s, the sound of hammers was the soundtrack of the nation. We weren't just building houses, we were building a new way of life. Back then, if you knew how to swing a hammer or pour concrete, you weren't just a laborer. Ty twórcą budownictwa. I remember my neighbor, Mr. Miller. He started as a simple carpenter's apprentice. By the time he was 40, he owned a small development company. In those days, land was cheap and the demand was endless. Every veteran coming home wanted a piece of the suburbs, a yard for the kids, and a white picket fence. The money in real estate and construction was staggering because of the sheer scale. You'd buy a few acres on the edge of town, what everyone called the sticks, and 5 years later, it was a bustling neighborhood. There were no complex zoning laws or decades of paperwork. You had a vision, you had the sweat equity, and the banks were ready to back you. I saw men make more money in a single summer of flipping houses, before that was even a TV term, than they could in 5 years at a desk job. It was about seeing the potential in a patch of weeds. And the best part, it was honest wealth. You could walk down a street 30 years later, point at a house and say, "I built that." It was a time when your hands were your greatest asset, and the ground beneath your feet was a gold mine waiting to be tapped.
While some were building houses, others were building brands. Welcome to the era of the great American consumer. This was the time when we learned that we didn't just need things, we wanted them. And the men who understood that, they became the new kings of New York and Chicago. Madison Avenue in the 60s was a high-stakes poker game. If you could come up with a catchy jingle or a slogan that stayed in people's heads, you were set for life. I'm talking about commissions that could buy a villa in the Hamptons. It was the age of the big idea. We saw the birth of the shopping mall, the rise of the department store, and the explosion of television advertising. But it wasn't just the guys in suits. Even the local retailers were getting rich. If you owned a car dealership or a franchise during the boom, you were the pillar of your community. People had money in their pockets, and they were eager to spend it on the latest gadgets, the fastest cars, and the newest fashions. The hustle here was psychological. It was about knowing what the American family dreamed of before they even knew it themselves. It was fast-paced, it was glamorous, and the rewards were immense. A single successful ad campaign could move millions of products and create a fortune overnight. It was a time when creativity was the most valuable currency in the world, and the American dream was the best-selling product on the market.
In the 70s, the highway wasn't just a road, it was a frontier. And the men driving the big rigs, they were the new cowboys. This was the era of the owner-operator. If you owned your own truck, you weren't just a driver. You were a small business owner with the entire continent as your office. Back then, trucking was a high-paying, high-status job. With the new interstate system, the country was more connected than ever. If you were willing to stay on the road for weeks at a time, if you knew how to handle a sleeper cab and a CB radio, you could make a very comfortable living. I remember the convoy era. The CB radio was our social media. We had our own language, our own codes, and a sense of brotherhood that you don't see much anymore. The money was in the long haul, moving produce from California to New York, or steel from Gary to Houston. If you were smart and kept your truck in good shape, you could pay it off in a few years and start a small fleet of your own. It was about freedom, the freedom to choose your loads, the freedom to see the country, and the freedom to earn as much as your stamina would allow. There were no GPS trackers or electronic logs back then, just you, the engine, and thousands of miles of opportunity. It was a hard life, sure, but for many of us, it was the only way to live.
We've talked about the factories and the highways, but we can't end this story without talking about the master trades, the plumbers, the electricians, the pipe fitters, the men who kept the lights on and the water running. In the golden age of the American economy, these were the blue-collar aristocrats. Being a union tradesman in the 60s and 70s meant you had reached a level of security that is rare today. You had a pension, you had top-tier health care, and you had a wage that allowed you to retire at 55 and move to Arizona.
But you earned it. You spent years as an apprentice learning the secrets of the craft from the old-timers who didn't tolerate mistakes. There was a profound dignity in that work. If you were a master welder, you knew your worth. You could walk onto any job site in the country and be hired on the spot. The money was steady, and the overtime was where the real wealth was built. You'd work the shutdowns at the local refinery or power plant, making more in a month than some people made in a year. But more than the money, it was about the golden handshake. It was a world where your skill was your bond. We looked after our own. We built the skyscrapers, the bridges, and the power grids that still stand today. We were the backbone of the nation, and the nation rewarded us for it. As we look back, we realize it wasn't just about the paychecks. It was about the pride of knowing that we built America with our own two hands. And that, my friends, is a legacy that no amount of money can replace.